Did you do that extra credit? Okay, you turned it in there, okay. Guys, we're gonna go ahead and finish up this section on factoring today. So, it's not like we're gonna learn anything new, except what's gonna happen is we're gonna put things together. So you won't be told, like, this is difference of squares, this is sum of cubes. You'd have to figure that out. On your practice quiz as well as your quiz, what I did is I set it up where I want to say there's like 20, 25 questions, something like that. And then what I did is I did group them. So like the first 4 or 5 are difference of squares, then some are difference of cubes, then graphing trinomials, then factor by grouping. And then the last like 5 or 6 or so are where you have to tell which kind it is and then also solve. So that's kind of another thing that we'll be doing today. So I tried to make the quiz so that the majority of the quiz is where I do tell you what kind of factoring it is. So just to go through this again, anytime you just have 2 terms, you're going to see if you can factor something out. If it's difference of squares, that's what you always want to check for first. And then if it's not that, check if it's sum or difference of cubes. If you have 3 terms, that's where we do the box and the table and see what we can do. If we could factor something out front first, though, we have to do that first. With 4, or this really could say 4 or 6, that's the most that we would do in this class. You'd factor something out. And then if you have 4 terms, you put them in 2 groups of 2. If you have 6 terms, you put it into 2 groups of 3. One of the things that makes this a little more difficult is that you'll have to factor one way, and then you'll have to take it and do difference of squares. And again, like I told you guys, you'll kind of get a hint like here. Like if you could take something further and you see this, that means when you're done with your first type, you're going to have to do factoring trinomials. This one is just a trinomial, but say you started with grouping and you saw this, that tells you you have to take it further, okay? All right, so these are both on your cheat sheet. Perfect cubes are on the back, perfect squares are on the back, okay? So again, today what we're doing is we're having to decide which way is it that we're going to do. And then later today, we'll talk about how do we solve. Okay, so this one has 2 terms. And if you look at that table, you're going to see, can I factor something out? And then is it difference of squares? So let's check that. In this one, there's nothing that goes into both 16 and 81. So then what I do is I think about, is this difference of squares? With difference of squares, you have to have a subtraction sign, and we have that. Your power has to be to an even number. So 2, 4, 6, 8 would be the highest you'd go. And then this number as well as this number have to be perfect squares. And if you notice, 16 is 1 as well as 81 is. So what that tells us is this is difference of squares. So we're going to do our 2 parentheses. We're going to make 1 plus and 1 minus. Okay. If this is x to the 4th, you put half of them here. So 2 here and 2 there. If this is 16, you take the sixth square root of 16, which is 4, and you put that in those two places. Then for the 81, what you do is you take the square root of it, and the square root of 81 is 9 and 9. And then you check, can you factor this more? This one has a plus sign. When you have two terms and you have a plus sign, the only thing you could do is sum of cubes. With sum of cubes, this would have to be to a power of 3 or 6 or 9, and it's not. This one is the minus, so you're going to check, is it difference of squares? And it is. This is to an even power. 4 and 9 are on your perfect squares. So that one can be factored more. So we bring this one down. And then we factor this. So I would have a plus and a minus. If this is x squared, I do an x and an x. If this is 4, the square root of 4 is 2 and 2. And the square root of 9 is 3 and 3. And that is your answer. This can't be factored anymore. This is the only minus one, and it's not to an even power. And 2 and 3 are not perfect squares. Now, if I look at this one, I have two terms again. And the first thing when you have any type of factoring, if you notice that you can factor something out front, you want to do that. And in this one, I can factor out a 2. So I look at 2 times what gives us 2r to the third. That's r to the third. Minus 2 times what is 128, and that would be 64. Okay. So this one has a cube. When it has a cube, you're going to think of sum or difference of cubes, and this has a minus sign, so it's difference of cubes. When I do difference of cubes, you would, if you don't know 64 is a cube, you want to check, and it is. Okay. So when I do this, what I do is you're still going to always carry that 2 down. You can't just forget about it. And then I always say, what is my A that's cubed here? And that would be R. And then what is cubed here? And for 64, it's 4 cubed. So my B would be 4. Okay. Now what I do is I copy down the formula for difference of cubes, which is right here. So it would be A minus B times A squared plus AB plus B squared. So that's your formula. And then you're just going to take R and 4 and substitute those in. So in for A, I put R, B is 4. A squared is R squared. A times B is 4 times R. And B squared is 16. This would be your answer. Now, this has 3 terms, so it's a trinomial. And when you do the trinomial, that's where you do the box on the table. And with these, if this is x to the 4th, we put the x to the 4th right here. This is negative 40. Remember that goes here and here. And then the negative 3 goes here. Now, when this is x to the 4th, you're going to have an x squared off to the side of here as well as there. Okay. Now we need to think about what are 2 factors that multiply to give us negative 40 and add to negative 3. 8. -8 times 5 is -40. -8 plus 5 is -3. So in front of one of these, I'm going to do a -8. In front of the other one, I'm going to do a 5. Okay. When you're deciding what goes outside the box, if it's x to the 4th, you're always going to have x squared times x squared. Then it's what times x squared gives me -8x squared, and that's -8. And then x squared times what gives me 5x squared, and that's 5. So when I go to factor this, one of my terms is x squared minus 8. And one of my terms is x squared plus 5. And then you do always want to check, could you factor one more? If it's x squared, it only works if it's minus, but 8 is not a perfect square, so it can't be factored. So this would be our answer. Now, if we go to our next page here, we have 2 terms. And if you look at your sheet for 2 terms, the first thing you always want to do is see, could I factor something out front? Okay. And how this is different than what we have been doing is notice it says solve each equation. And so it's set equal to 0. So this is what the last like 6 or 7, 5, 6 or 7 of your quiz and practice quiz will be like. So what you would do here first is just factor it, okay? And what I can take out of this is a 3. And then I have 4 t's here and 2 t's here. So I can take the smaller amount out front, okay? And then I would look at 3t squared times what gives me 3t to the 4th. Well, I'd need 2 more t's. And then it would be minus 3t squared times what gives me a -48t squared, and that would be -16. And then that equals 0. Okay. Now what you need to do is see, could I factor this more? And this is difference of squares. This is squared, it has a minus sign. 16 is a perfect square. So then I go 3t squared, and I use difference of squares here. With difference of squares, one is plus and one is minus. If this is t squared, I have a t and a t. And then if this is 16, what I put here and here is the square root of that, which is 4 and 4. Now, what makes this different is that it's set equal to 0. What we've done so far is factored it, and the whole reason you factor is so you can find what x is. So now what I'd have to do is I'd have to set the 3t squared equal to 0, the t plus 4 equal to 0, and the t minus 4 equal to 0, and solve each of those. Okay. So here we would divide by 3, and we would get t squared equals 0 divided by 3. 0 divided by anything is 0. To get rid of a t squared, we take the square root, and the square root of 0 is just 0. So that is one of our answers. Okay. Here you subtract 4. And so t would equal a -4. And then here we add 4. So t would equal 0 plus 4 is 4. Now, one thing I will tell you, if you have something equal to 0 that doesn't have a plus or a minus, so like if it just said 4t equals 0 or 6t to the 3rd equals 0, that is always going to be 0. If it's equal to 0 and there's no plus or minus, that's always going to be 0. A shortcut here, which I kind of hesitate to say this because in the past I've had students get this wrong with this shortcut, is when you're going from t plus 4 equals 0 to this, it's always just the opposite of this. And if this is plus 4, it's negative 4. If this is negative 4, it's a positive. So you can kind of save the word if you understand them. So now let's look at this one. And this one we have x to the 4th, and that's 3 terms. You have 3 terms, you're going to use the trinomial factoring box and table. The 36 goes here as well as here. The negative 13 goes here. And if it's x to the 4th, that tells us one of these boxes, each of these boxes off to the side is going to be x squared. Now, this one you have to remember, if you ever have a minus sign and then a plus sign when you're doing trinomial factoring, both of your factors have to be negative. Okay? You have a minus sign and then a plus, both factors have to be negative. So you're going to think of what are 2 negative numbers that multiply to give me a positive 36, and when I add them, it gives me a negative 13. Anyone think of what that would be? They're both going to be negative. Negative 9 times negative 4 is a positive 36. Negative 9 plus a negative 4 is negative 13. Very good. So one of these is going to have a negative 9. One's going to have a negative 4. Okay. Now when I go and decide what do I put outside of the box, if this is x to the 4th, I do x squared and x squared. This is going to be a negative 9 times x squared gives us that. X squared times what gives us negative 4x squared. This would need to be a negative 4. You can always check it, multiply these and get that. So when I do this, here I have x squared minus 9. Here I have x squared minus 4. And that equals 0. Now, we have 2 things with squares. And what I want to think about there is, could I factor these more? Is this difference of squares? Is this difference of squares? Yes. So when it's difference of squares, this is to even, this is minus, this is a perfect square. So I have, that's going to break down into two things, plus and minus. If this is x squared, it's x and x. If that's 9, it's 3 and 3. Okay. Now for this one. Okay, this is also difference of squares. So you have plus and minus. If it's x squared, you have x and x. Square root of 4 is 2 and 2. Now, if you use that shortcut way that I said, do you guys get for this one when you solve it, because it's equal to 0, it'd be the opposite of a plus 3, so that's negative 3. And if you wanted to, because we have 4 in a row, you could just say x equals and then just put commas and add them. Okay, so this one's negative 3. This one's going to be a positive 3. This is going to be a negative 2, and this one's going to be a positive 2. Or you could have said x equals for all 4 of them. Now, if I look at C, this one has 4 terms. With 4 terms, we use factor by grouping. So that means we're going to group the first 2 together as well as the second 2 together. For this one here, you're thinking, what can you factor out? And that's x squared. And then it's x squared times what gives me x to the 3rd? That's x. X squared times what gives me 2x squared? That's 2. Now, again, when I do factor by grouping, a lot of times your third term is negative. So I kind of cheat. If this is x plus 2, I know this is x plus 2. And I look at what do I take out front? And I would take out a -9. -9 times x is -9x. -9 times a +2 is -18. Then what I do when I'm doing this, I take the one that is common in both. If you don't have something common in both, you've done something wrong. And then for my other term, I take what is in front here and what is in front there. If this was a positive number, you would add a plus sign there. Okay, so that is going to be x squared minus 9. And again, it's equal to 0. Now, could I factor this one more? Yes, this is difference of squares. So what I have to do there then is say plus minus, that's x squared, it's x and x. Square root of 9 is 3 and 3, and that equals 0. Now I'm to the point where I can solve. So here, x would be the opposite of this, which is -2. The opposite of this, which is -3. Opposite of -3 is 3. Okay. So now let's look at this. So here we have another trinomial, but I have to show you this because when we go to solve this, it's going to be different. So this is x to the 4th, so I'm going to have an x squared off to the side, an x squared off to the side. This is going to be -40 as well as this, and this is -3. So can you guys think of two factors of -40 that give me a -3? -8 and 5, thank you. And -8 plus 5 is -3. So one of these is going to have a -8, one's going to have a 5. Then when I go to put my terms outside, this is going to be x squared times x squared. This is going to be a -8. This is going to be a 5. Okay, so one of my factors is x squared minus 8. One is x squared minus 5, and it's equal to 0. Now this one's a little bit different to solve because neither of these are difference of squares. So you can't factor this anymore. When that happens, what you have to do is take that x squared minus 8 and set it equal to 0 and solve it. Then you have to take your x squared minus 5 and set it equal to 0 and solve it. Okay? When I do this, I would add 8. And I get x squared equals 8. Yes, thank you. Thank you. So when I get to this, do you guys know that you take the square root? Okay. Now, when you take the square root of something, the first thing you have to realize is that it's going to be plus or minus. And then if you remember doing this like a month or so ago, you think, is there a perfect square that goes into 8? So we can simplify that. And 8 is 4 times 2. So what you would have to do there is take the square root of 4 and bring a 2 out front. So that would be plus or minus 2 times the square root of 2. Now on the test, if you gave me plus or minus the square root of 8, you're still going to get the majority of the points. But truthfully, it should go down more to that. Okay. Now this one, I'm going to subtract 5. and I'd get x squared equals a negative 5. Take the square root of both sides. When you take the square root of both sides, you have to remember to add the plus or minus. And what do we do if we have a negative under a square root? Do you remember? Take an I out front, and there are no perfect squares that divide into root 5, so you would just leave it like that. Okay, so to have that plus, you have to do that. Okay, now if I look at B, this has two terms, and it's going to be difference of squares. If this has a minus, this is an even power. 49 is a perfect square, and 25 is a perfect square. Okay, now when it's like that, difference of squares, you're going to have a plus and a minus. This is x squared. We do an x and an x. We take the square root of 49, which is 7, and that goes here and here. We do the square root of 25, and that goes here and here. Now, this also has a shortcut way, but I'm going to show you the long way first, and then I'll explain the shortcut way. So if you set each of these equal to 0 and solve them, you subtract 5, and you get 7x equals a negative 5, divide by 7, and x is a negative 5/7. That's an answer. Here, you'd add 5, and you would get 7x equals 5, divide by 7, and x equals 5/7. Now, it's perfectly fine to show this where you can get your answers, but if you like a shortcut, another shortcut is when you have something like this that just has a normal x. You can't do this if it has an x squared, but if it has just an x, you take the opposite sign of this, which is negative 5, and you divide it by what's here, which is 7. You take the opposite of this, which is a regular 5, and you divide it by 7. If this could be reduced, like say it was 5/10, then you would want to reduce it. Okay. All right, let's look at this. We're going to group these two, and we're going to do factor by grouping. In this first part, I can take out a 3 as well as a t. And then I look at 3t times what gives me 21th, that's 7h, minus 3t times what gives me a minus 3t, that's a minus 1. This times this has to give me that negative 3t. Now I'm going to look at the second part, and I'm going to look at what can I take out front, okay? What I can take out front of that, because that third one is negative, again, I'm going to just copy my common factor over. And then I'm going to look here. What times 7h is negative 35h? I would need negative 5. And then negative 5 times a negative 1 is a plus 5. Okay. Now, when you go to do this, remember we write this one down first. Then we write this and this down next, which is 3t minus 5, and that equals 0. Yeah.
Oh, can we write it like opposite everything?
Yes, absolutely. You mean like these two switch? Yes, absolutely. Now this one, I want you to notice has an H and it has a T. So because of that, when you write your answer, you have to specify which is your H and which is your T. Do you guys get what I said before? If we did that shortcut way, you take the opposite of this, which would be a +1, and you divide it by that, so it'd be over 7. When I do my t, I do the opposite of this, which is a +5, and I divide it by 3. Those are my answers. And notice one's an H and one's a T. All right, so let's see here. Let's do this one. Okay, so this is a trinomial. We have x to the 4th. This would be x squared as well as x squared. This would be -18, -18, and -7. What are two factors of -18 that gives us -7? And -9 plus 2 is -7. So then if I go back here, I'm gonna put -9 in front of one of these and 2 in front of one. This is x to the 4th. I have x squared times x squared. What times x squared gives me this would be -9. What times x squared gives me this would be 2, and that would be a plus. So one of my factors would be x squared minus 9. One would be x squared plus 2. And now what I have to do is I have to factor this. Is this difference of squares, right? So this is x plus 3 times x minus 3. This one, I cannot do anything more with that. So this one, I'm going to set up as x squared plus 2 equals 0, and I'm going to solve that separately. Okay, so it's like this equals 0 as well as this equals 0. Here, my answer is going to be a -3 and a +3. Here, I would subtract 2. And I'd get x squared equals a -2. Then I would take my square root. And remember, when you do that, it's plus or minus. What do I do if it's negative? I and then root 2. So these are 2 answers that we have, and this is 2 answers that we have. You wait to see one more. Okay. So I will give you your worksheet. And I believe the worksheet is no. On the replace now. I think this is really hard. To that. I don't know if I will do this or not, but tomorrow we're going to return books if you don't have this class next trimester. And did we talk about this? Do all of you have it next July? Does anyone have it in the spring? Okay, we did talk about that one, right? So yeah, just a few of you will be returning your books tomorrow.